Don't look at the man wrapped in plastic. My uncle is a police officer. He typically does highway patrol and doesn't like to talk about work a lot because it's both mundane and unpleasant, and it's very rare something amusing happens. No one wants to hear about fatal accidents and speeding stops. They want to hear the story about the drunken college student who couldn't remember how to put his pants back on in the middle of an intersection during morning rush hour. Unfortunately, the funny stories are few and far between, so mostly he doesn't say anything. When I turned 16, my uncle had me drop by the police station, ostensibly to pick up something for my mom. It was a ruse. I found myself confronted by a number of his coworkers, took me aside, and had the talk with me. 2 talks, actually. One about going off to college in a few years and the dangers I would face, and to never leave my drink unattended, and don't walk around by myself after dark, and blah, 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 blah. The other was about driving. Cell phones weren't in heavy use at the time, so they didn't talk about texting, but they did warn me against having a lot of noisy friends in the car, always wearing a seatbelt, driving defensively, etc. I'd heard all of it before, but it was nice that he cared about my safety, I suppose. There was one officer, however, who told me something I hadn't heard. He was an older gentleman, probably near retirement, and he hung near the edge of the group until everyone was done with their stories meant to scare me into smart choices. Then he said he'd take me to say hi to my uncle, who was at his desk, and he told me something strange on the way there. "There's a man wrapped in plastic in the city," he said. "He hangs out around the edges of the highway. If you see him, don't look at his face. He'll be mostly covered, so you won't see it unless you really look. If you can't see his face, then how do you know it's a man?" I asked. I was a bit testy from being ambushed by all my uncle's coworkers and was not in the mood to indulge in ghost stories. "I guess I don't," he admitted. "But that's not important. Every now and then," he said, "they'd respond to an accident caused by a man covered in plastic. A motorist would spot a piece of trash by the side of the road, a big piece standing upright, and it would be wrapped in just the right way that it looked like a human figure. Just some stray debris blown around by the wind. Initially, the police thought the resulting accidents or near misses that occurred were from momentary distraction of trying to understand what they'd seen. But reports kept coming, and the trend was unmistakable. A human figure, swaddled in plastic, wrapped tight like the winding of a corpse. Even the head was covered. Everyone that saw it had crashed shortly after or had a near miss. Everyone that saw the man's face died. I laughed a little and, thinking myself smart, asked how they knew seeing his face was the trigger if all the people that saw it died shortly after. His jaw tightened and something in me trembled, realizing that I'd asked something painful to him, a memory he tried to suppress. I began to think that maybe there was something to his story. He told me he'd responded to an accident many years ago. The man driving had survived. His wife had not. The man was hysterical, and the officer had tried to pull him away from the scene, tried to get him to go to the waiting ambulance. Anything to make him stop looking at his wife's crushed body. He remembered amidst the man's babbling that this was his fault and that he'd killed his wife. Untrue, but it was understandable that he'd blame himself. That the man had said he'd seen someone standing by the side of the road, and he'd glanced only briefly, but his wife had turned in her seat to look back at him and see what the figure was doing. She'd started screaming, something about their face, how it was all wrong, and she had to get away from it. She started clawing at the door, trying to open it. And that's when the vehicle in the other lane had swerved without explanation and hit the passenger side, killing his wife. "That's really fucked up," I said when he was finished, and his lips narrowed into a thin line, and he told me I shouldn't swear like that and didn't say anything else about the man in plastic. I asked my uncle about it later. He looked uncomfortable and shrugged and told me it was true that they had a lot of reports about a man in plastic. "Just be careful," he said. "Don't be distracted by anything on the side of the road, whether mundane or some weird local ghost story." It's been many years since that talk, and the idea of a man wrapped in plastic stuck with me. I'm not superstitious. I figure there had to be a logical explanation, that maybe people were mistaken in what they saw and the police were looking for a pattern that wasn't there. Well, if that's all there was to it, I wouldn't be posting. A few weeks ago, I saw the man in plastic. It was exactly as the older police officer said. He was unremarkable, merely another piece of debris blown up against the barrier separating the two sides of the highway. I would have paid it no attention if it weren't for the curve of the shoulders, the line of the legs. Unmistakably a human figure, slate gray like an overcast sky, crinkled with musty light from the reflection of the plastic. I thought at first it was a man in a hoodie, inexplicably and dangerously leaning on the barrier in the middle of the highway. Then, as my car approached, I realized it was one solid piece covering him from head to toe. Looked like a funeral wrap, I thought, from the old tradition of winding the body in a sheet. My car drew even with where he stood. He shifted, his shoulders twisted, and he began to turn his head to me. I remembered my uncle's warning. I tore my eyes away just in time to see something fall from the vehicle in front of me. I thought in that instant that it was a washing machine that had fallen out of the back of the pickup in front of me. Later, after the police arrived, I realized it was something much bigger and far more sturdy, which helped explain what happened to the car that was right behind me. I swerved into the other lane. My uncle had told me to always keep track of where other cars are so that I knew where it was safe to maneuver in an emergency. And I'd been doing that, and I knew there were no cars riding along beside me. I missed the debris. The car that had been following perhaps a little too close behind me? Not so lucky. The front end of his car clipped the machinery. I saw it turn sideways, spinning from the impact. Saw it roll. It came to a stop in the grass on the shoulder. I pulled over, braking as hard as I dared, fumbling for my cell phone with shaking hands. I called 911, gave them my location, and then, disoriented and perhaps a little in shock, dropped the phone and went to go check on the other driver. The damage to his car was less than I expected. The frame was bent near the top of the driver's side door, the sides were dented, and the windshield was shattered. But that was all. He wasn't moving as I approached, and I honestly don't know why I kept going. He's dead, he's dead, he's dead, was all that was running through my mind. But then he raised his head and stared about him in confusion. He reached up a hand and touched the shattered windshield in shock. Then I was there by the car, and he unlocked the door, and I wrenched it open. He looked fine. There were no visible injuries. A laptop lay in the passenger side floor. I saw his face, he whimpered at me. I saw it. And then he wrapped his arms around his body and began to rock back and forth and screamed. A long, plaintive scream. And when his lungs were empty, he sucked in another breath and began screaming again. I felt helpless. I tried to get him to stop. I grabbed his shoulder and tried to hold him against the seat so he'd stop rocking, and he began to twist and thrash instead, moaning and weeping. So I let him go, and he just sat there and rocked and screamed and wept about the face he had seen. He did this until the ambulance arrived to take him away. I've been having nightmares about this every single night since it happened. About the accident, watching that car tumble, helpless to do anything. I dream about a man screaming and rocking, and I'm trying to get to him to help, but he's always out of reach. And I dream about that man in plastic, and I wake up just before he turns to look at me, panting and shaking and cold with sweat. I'm crying a lot. I get panicky when I see a pickup with anything in the back. And after I stop, I have to sit there for a moment and catch my breath and wait for my heart to slow down. This is all normal, I feel, considering what happened. I'm trying to work through it, to not let it keep me from doing something so vital as driving. I've got an appointment with a therapist scheduled for next week. I found out what happened to that man. I asked my uncle, and he came over to my house that evening. He sat down at my kitchen table while I made tea and asked if I really wanted to know. And that was enough to indicate that the news was not going to be good. I sat down opposite him and said that, yes, I wanted to know. He died, my uncle told me. On the way to the hospital, he'd started growing more and more frantic and aggressive, screaming the same thing over and over again. The face was wrong. The face was wrong. The face was wrong. Then he'd gone into a seizure and was dead before they even reached the hospital. They believed the laptop, which was in the passenger side seat, had struck him in the head when the car rolled, which caused bleeding in the brain. I thanked him, said maybe knowing would give me some closure, and my uncle left. He seemed uncomfortable enough telling me that the man had died. So I didn't want to worry him further by saying I had seen the man in plastic. You see, I'm encountering him everywhere now. I catch glimpses of debris on the side of the road, dirty off-white sheets, shiny black tatters fluttering in the breeze, or stained gray scraps. And each time, I can't help but look, only for a moment, just long enough to realize that it has taken the shape of a man. I look back at the road before he can turn his head, before I see his face. I wonder, has he always been there and I'm finally noticing? Or is he targeting me? Should I have died instead of the man in the car behind me? I don't know. But if you see something like a man standing at the side of the highway, don't look. Keep driving. Don't look any longer than a second in case he turns his head and you see his face.